Thanks for coming to this meeting of Friends of a Free Iran. We are holding this event after the recent uprisings that have shaken Iran. This week also coincides with the 39th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution against the Shah's dictatorship in 1979, which was, unfortunately, hijacked by Islamist fundamentalists who have been ruling Iran since then. This year, the Iranian people have again come to the streets and are calling for the downfall of the regime. I said during the plenary debate on Iran in January, in the face of the demonstrations that have shaken Iran as a whole, the Mullah regime reacted with unacceptable brutality. Thousands of protesters were put in jail. In the face of such events, a strong reaction from the European Union was needed. And I regret to say that this reaction did not live up to what is expected of the European Union. It was not until January 3, 4 days after Mr. Trump, that Mrs. Mogherini merely called, I quote, all parties, I repeat, all parties to abstain from violence. So she made no difference between the regime's torturers and their victims. I think the European Union must urgently correct its shortcomings. We must express our full solidarity with the people of Iran so they would get a message that we are on their sides. We are indeed critical of the current EU approach. The people of Iran bravely went to the streets calling for freedom and regime change. But it seems that the EU does not want to hear their message. We are very worried about the protesters who have been arrested. One of the top officials of the Iranian government has said that more than 5,000 have been arrested. Already, more than 10 have died in custody, some of them under torture. The regime's officials, including the so-called supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, have blamed the PMOI for leading the protests and have talked about executing members of this opposition movement. This shows how much the regime is afraid of the PMOI and the movement under the leadership of Mrs. Rajavi. But it also makes us very worried and reminds of the brutality with which they repress the opposition, as in 1988 when 30,000 political prisoners were executed and the world was silent. This time, we cannot longer be silent. The EU must give this strong message to the Iranian regime that we will not tolerate the execution of even one protester. Otherwise, we should impose sanctions to make sure that the mullah understand that for continuing the repression and execution, they will have to pay an heavy price. I thank you for your attention.
Really, the uprising in Iran, which began at the end of December, has, I believe, changed the political landscape in Iran and in the region. It's clearly demonstrated that the sort of theories and analysis put forward by the apologists for the Iranian regime are just plain wrong. For years, we've been told by the regime and its supporters, and that includes the EU's own foreign policy officials, that this is a very stable country with no real opposition and that the Islamic Republic of Iran has millions of supporters and so on. Many of us, particularly those of us here as the Friends of Free Iran have never accepted this propaganda. And why? Because we believe the Iranian people, and especially the young men and women of Iran, could not possibly tolerate these backward mullahs and their reactionary ideology. We have never believed that people like Rouhani and his foreign minister Zarif are moderates. And we could not believe in the Iranian elections because there was no opposition, and those who were allowed to stand in these so-called elections were later disqualified by the Council of Guardians, a completely unelected body. So we cannot believe the regime's assurances about its nuclear programme, because they lied to us for years. It was only when their secret nuclear sites were revealed by the opposition NCRI and sanctions were imposed that the regime agreed to sign the nuclear deal. So we have not been deceived by the lies and the pro-regime lobby's propaganda. And the recent uprising has proved us right. All that Maryam Rajavi told us in December about the weaknesses of this regime was absolutely correct. In fact, just a few weeks after Mrs. Rajavi spoke in the European Parliament, the nationwide protest began. And those protests spread to 142 cities. So the Iranian regime, which up to that point had been very reticent to even mention the name of the PMOI or Mrs. Rajavi, was forced to openly admit the very effective role that this opposition is playing in the uprising. In a way, the regime has told us who and where it sees its main opposition. So our governments and our policymakers in the EU must revise their view of Iran. They should recognise the explosive situation in that country, and they should rethink their attitude towards the main Iranian opposition before it is too late. We must be on the side of the Iranian people. We must give them hope that they are not alone. We must support their fight against Islamic fundamentalism. We must show solidarity with the Iranian people. Thank you.